Hello, everybody, and even if you don't have a body. I'm Layman Pascal, and this is the Integral Stages Meta Podcast, where we dive into people who are trying to bring forward higher, deeper, more developmental, and more transformative content through online projects. Today, I'm talking with Damien Walter in Bali. His YouTube channel focuses on the dynamics of creating and appreciating science fiction and other fantastic genres. But he's also branched into philosophy, interviewing John Vervaeke, discussing metamodernity, tasting the integral pickle. And we're happy to have him here today to talk about, I hope, the intersections between wisdom and world building, philosophy and fantastica, Martians and maturations, deep space and deep souls. Hi, Damien.
Hey, Layman. That's a fantastic introduction. I'm trying to remember it all in my head so I can tick it off as we speak.
Well, I want to get into some big arcane questions that are in the back of my mind, but why don't you give us a brief sense of what it is you're doing online, why you started doing that, and why the heck are you in Bali?
Okay, yeah. Why am I in Bali, and who am I? So I'm Damien Walter. I'm probably best known. I've achieved vague internet fame a few times in my life, but I'm probably best known for writing for The Guardian. And I wrote for that esteemed newspaper for like 7 or 8 years, all about science fiction. And I've written for the BBC, Wired, Eon magazine, a bunch of others as well. Really criticism, cultural criticism based on science fiction. And I was like either blessed or cursed to just be thrown into this world with this obsession for science fiction. My mum was a science fiction reader. My grandfather was a science fiction reader. He had a collection of H.G. Wells and Jules Verne. So it's kind of a family thing. And I just found myself really obsessed with trying to understand what science fiction is. So I become a critic of that area of speculative, fantastic literature. And a few years ago, I decided to bring that into the YouTube space because I'd been primarily a writer, but I've always been fascinated by filmmaking and the craft of video. And I think it was around the period of Casey Neistat. And so many people were drawn into YouTube by him. So I came a bit late to YouTubing and then podcasting. So I now host the science fiction podcast as well. Why I'm in Bali is because it's beautiful, and also it facilitates this kind of lifestyle that I live. So I left the UK around 2013 to be actually to write a feature article about digital nomads, and I wrote that, and it got read by a lot of people at the time. It's called Slouching Toward Neiman Haman, and it compared like the digital nomad subculture that was emerging at the time with like hippies and beats and various countercultural figures from the time, except with more of a focus on building businesses and making money than those people had potentially had. And then I decided to go digital nomad as well. So I've been doing that since 2013. So that's 8 years now. And these last 2 years, as we've all been locked inside, I decided to do that here in Bali, which has been pretty good. Yeah, thank you.
My father and brother were stuck in Indonesia, when COVID started. And they had to spend a few more months there than they wanted, and they loved it. And he thinks he's going to go back to get married there. And so I've been invited to a hypothetical Bali wedding. Mm-hmm. Maybe we'll see you at some point. So you mentioned sort of being born into this love of science fiction, as if it was part of you and part of your household. I'm interested sort of in the specifics of that. You know, I think about my own, let's say, autobiography with science fiction. You know, my mom read us Narnia and Lord of the Rings really early on. And then I graduated to sort of salacious, thought-provoking juvenile sci-fi. I read a lot of Piers Anthony and Roger Zelazny and Harry Harrison. And by my teens, I kind of only wanted either really dark fantasy like Clive Barker and the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant or Lovecraft, or I wanted really philosophically heavy sci-fi like Frank Herbert, Neil Stephenson, even Colin Wilson, Robert Anton Wilson, Philip K. Dick. So what about you? What's your specific history in terms of who you really got turned on by and who you came across that, oh, I need to assimilate this guy?
I think it started for me. by being read to by my mother. And she read to me C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. And maybe a bit too young for C.S. Lewis. She read me like his Mars trilogy, which is quite sophisticated, like theological material, as is Narnia. But Narnia, C.S. Lewis kind of creeps up on you with it. And I felt a little bit betrayed. I remember when I think back, when I realized that, what you mean Aslan is Jesus? That's not what I was thinking when I was reading this story. So there was that kind of, and, you know, retrospectively, I can see there was something about, you know, I was growing up in a culture that was completely secular, completely atheist, never went to church, never thought about religion or spirituality in any sense of the word. And also, I was growing up actually in quite a bleak place on a big housing estate, which for American viewers is like a housing project. Somewhere I went back to a few years ago, and it's not the worst place in the world, but just kind of gray and not a very happy place to grow up. So fantasy just became really important to me. Lord of the Rings, Dragonlance novels, superhero comic books, and on the science fiction side, like Arthur C. Clarke. I read all of the books by Arthur C. Clarke when I was like 8, 9, 10 or so, really to achieve some kind of escape from where I was. Comic books, role-playing games, early video games at the same time as well. The whole of what we call nerd culture, now that it's been commodified into a product that we can sell to the world. But I was into it a little bit before that. Original gangster nerd, you might say. Nice. But as I kind of went into my teens and then like my 20s, I was starting to wonder, like, what is my interest in this really about? Do I just want to escape? And I remember watching actually The Matrix with Keanu Reeves. And the first time I saw that and coming out of the cinema and thinking, like, what was that I just watched? Yeah. Why did it have this effect on me? Like the moment that Keanu Reeves takes off at the end of the movie and flies away and he's achieved his superpowers, I had like, I would call it kind of a spiritual enlightenment experience at that time. And it's because I was seeing in that character, like the potential for freedom and liberation and all of these ideas that I didn't really know much about. But I was exploring them through science fiction and through fantasy and escapism. And one of the essays that I wrote for Ian magazine a few years ago now was about this duality between escapism and escape. And there's a quote actually from Michael Moorcock, the great British like fantasy writer, where he says, jailers love escapism, it's escape that they can't stand. So one of the things I've explored a lot in writing is, what are we doing? Are we practicing escapism in our fantasy lives or role-playing games, video games? And I chatted with John Viveki about this in our interview. Or is there actually some avenue to escape through this? And this has been my fascination as a critic, trying to understand to what extent fantasy, horror, science fiction, which have become super popular, which are really at the heart of our culture now, are they just something that we are escaping into, or are they providing us some real route back to spirituality, religion, ideas of liberation, and so on?
It's a really interesting distinction to try to make, and it reminds me of something that comes up in martial arts, comes up in spiritual practice, is a kind of a similar distinction between, say, avoidance and evading. Right? You don't want this, you want to be able to face everything and not be contracted away from it, because whether it's your opponent or your lover or reality, if you're not facing what is, you're not going to be existentially present enough to have a spiritual relationship with it. But you still have to not get eaten by tigers. So there's a difference between avoiding and evading. And I'm curious then, in terms of escaping and escape, what do you see as the fundamental distinction? What have you come to in your pondering?
Well, I still don't have an answer for it. that's why I went to seek the wisdom of John Vervaeke, because he helped me kind of work through some of it. So at the time I was thinking a lot about Star Wars. I'm teaching a course at the moment. This is one of the things I do in my nomadic online life is teach storytelling, creative writing. I was for a few years I was teaching creative writing at the university level in the UK, mostly for adult learners. In fact, quite a lot of my background is kind of really social work, working with the arts and specifically writing. So I started doing that just when I'd finished college, actually, and I was living in a city called Leicester in the United Kingdom. It's one of the poorest cities in the UK, one of the poorest cities in Europe, actually. And I turned up there for university and I wanted to write and make films, maybe. And I actually became fascinated with the city that I was living in, and I started running writing workshops for people in the local libraries. And when I finished college, that kind of became a job. And I spent about a decade doing that, building up projects, running festivals, that kind of thing. And what I started to realize is that the people I was working with, the problems that were based around like poverty, like I ran writing workshops in prisons, in mental health centers, old people's homes, and trying to work with people who were often in like very difficult circumstances. And I started to realize that everyone had this story going on internally. And when people were in a really difficult place, it was like their story was broken and they couldn't fulfill it. So I kind of specialized in working with young men like myself at the time, often who were suffering from very serious depression, like lock-in syndrome or schizophrenia. And they were always science fiction fans of a really profound kind, like they had read everything by Philip K. Dick, or they had written a 20,000 word thesis on The Matrix, for instance. And there was something about these stories that was, well, I wasn't sure at the time. Was it helping them, or was it part of the problem, this fascination with science fiction? So that was kind of my starting point for thinking about stories then and what they mean to people. So I returned to education and started researching storytelling. Basically, I read every source you can find about telling stories, from kind of screenwriting manuals like Story by Robert McKee, into creative writing books. And that then led me also into areas of psychology, where stories have been a major part of the inspiration for people like Freud and Jung, and other areas of like politics and philosophy as well, where stories just crop up again and again. And I realized I was trying to understand stories in some way. So when I left the UK and was traveling, I started putting together what was like 10 years of research into the first online course that I taught, which is called The Rhetoric of Story. And that is kind of a way of approaching story that is independent of medium. So how do you tell a story in books, films, video games, puppet shows, whatever it is? And that gave me some ideas about what story actually is and how it's keyed into our psychology and psychological structures. And that then led me back to science fiction, and that's circuitously bringing me to an answer to your question, I think. And that's that we all have an internal narrative, a story, and a myth in some ways. I think Jordan Peterson has repopularized this Jungian idea of understanding your myth, because it may not be a good one, the story that you're living out. And for many people who are in like a pathological space, they're living out a very bad, unhealthy story. So I think what we're doing in storytelling, and then specifically in science fiction, is trying to shape healthy stories for our inner world that actually fit in to this crazy landscape that we're living in, because we're not, you know, tribal beings anymore who can just have a simple hero's tale to live out. We're living in this age of science and technology and high-speed technological change, and that's really screwing with us psychologically. So many of us are finding answers, are finding kind of new patterns of stories that we live out in science fiction. And I think therefore that's healthy. But the temptation to slip into the escapist mold, and the fact that science fiction is now so commodified for us, mean that, of course, it's always very easy for it to become escapism instead.
Seems like there's the possibility for almost the same story to be transformative, developmental, or a trap. I'm thinking about your spiritual experience seeing Keanu Reeves have his Gnostic escape at the end of the first Matrix.
Yeah.
And so either someone can look at that and say, this is an example of how someone completes their story, transforms it into a healthy story, and achieves that upgrade that they're looking for in their lives. Or you look at the next two films, you go, oh, he didn't really get out. That was all part of the delusion. By trying to get out of his story, he ended up even more trapped in it. Or you could look at it in the kind of developmental stage sense and go, well, yeah, he really did level up, but the next level is even more complicated. So yeah, it's tricky that all those options can converge in a single story structure.
Yeah, and we do this very much with our storytelling at the moment, I think. Like, we have this cultural archetype now, the hero's journey. So we drag this back into life through kind of Joseph Campbell in the, in like the 40s and 50s, he was working on that. And then it's kind of popularized through Star Wars, of course. So I think most people are probably familiar with like the 17 stages of the hero's journey now. And that's, it's the Matrix, it's the Harry Potter movies, it's Batman, it's, so many stories use that hero's journey archetype now. But then the question about it is this a healthy archetype, or is it, I think the term that is helpful for me is another Vivekian idea, self-deception, that whenever we kind of step into the religious or the spiritual or the mythic realm, there's this massive possibility for self-deception. And I think many of us are in self-deception with the hero's journey, because it's feeding our egoic identities and kind of telling us, well, the answer is to just be the hero, have all the attention, have my tribe gathered around me, adoring me. And what we leave out of these stories is the sacrifice that is going to have to go with that if you pursue that path. The hero of the Hollywood movie just gets to the end of the movie and is the hero. But of course, for like the real archetypes, the hero's journey, like Jesus Christ, that only happens after you've been nailed to the cross. To go back to Jordan Peterson again, once you've lifted up the suffering of the world and realize that you can carry it and end up a bloody mess at the end of it. But I think we leave that part out of our Hollywood storytelling and our Marvel, Disney storytelling now. And that kind of brings us back to deceiving ourselves and escapism again.
There's an interesting interplay there for me in terms of the individual and maybe we'll call it the collective. The individual can use the story to deceive themselves and evade or avoid the sacrifice. But it seems like the society can use the same kind of adventure to try to trick the individual. Because when the hero returns to the tribe in the Joseph Campbell sense, there's different ways that return can be accomplished. They can return shamanically transformed as someone who is deeper than the tribe and can then maybe be of real use to the tribe in facing a greater reality. Or they can just return to be installed in the tribe, which seems like, in terms of society and economics and ideology, what the tribe would really like. Would like to say, go and have your little adventure and prepare yourself to be self-sacrificing, and then return and become one of us and live a life sacrificed to us, and don't disturb the status quo that we've set up. We would love you to have a hero's journey, as long as by hero, it means you coming back and fitting in. What do you think about that side? Do you think there are ways where social collectives exploit our sense of what it means to go on a hero's journey?
Yes, absolutely. And we've mechanized this process in the 21st century. So one of the things I also do with my storytelling knowledge now is I do some work over in the corporate sector with the most ethical clients that I can find, because I've become very aware that these storytelling structures, and the hero's journey is really only the beginning of that, but we can play with that. They're very consciously used by businesses and by marketing operations, public relations, the media, news organizations, and it's all about getting and holding people's attention and then selling it on to people. So the area that we're doing this massively now is in video games. And you look at what's happening with kind of smartphone games or even the more quality games on like PlayStation or so on. They're all, well, what's called gamified. So not only are they a game, but they have these game structures within them that you're continually progressing through. You're raising up your level, you're getting more gold coins, you can buy a village, which you then control, or one of the female characters in the story, if you're playing a male character, falls in love with you. So actually we've taken all of these core desires of human life, all the parts of the heroic story that you might want to live as an individual, and we've just mechanized them into our kind of marketing, money-making frameworks. And of course, we do this with products. We associate just basic consumer products with you successfully completing your life journey as well. And there's no one person or organization doing this. We've just proliferated it across our culture as normalized as marketing. I think maybe we need to rename the marketing industry somehow, because it's too friendly a name to give to what's actually happening there.
Yeah, maybe black magic would be a better
Black magic. Yes.
There's two different ways stories can have an effect. Well, there's more than two, but I'm fascinated by the relationship between the unfolding structure of the story and what that does to us as participants, but also stories as delivery vehicles for certain concepts, right? Philip K. Dick's stories are often like that. There's sometimes not much of a story. It just gave you one really interesting idea that you now have. And there's how to think about this. There's a great cosmocentric developmentalist philosophy called the Fourth Way, associated with the teachings of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky. And one of the neat features of that philosophy is this idea of a magnetic center, right? And that the idea is that among all the cultural artifacts and information we receive and get programmed by, there are some ideas that reach us as if downstream from the wise, more developed ancestors. And if you get enough of these little splinter magnets, they ball up together and become a big magnet, and that magnet starts to pull you towards the way or authentic transformation or an actually wise person or whatever is available for you. And when I was a kid, it seemed like that's what science fiction was doing in terms of these nested fragments inside the stories. When I saw Luke calmly focus and move that lightsaber, or when I saw Paul Atreides keep his hand in the Gom Jabbar pain box, those were moments where I was alerted to the fact that human culture might contain higher consciousness or different capacities or the potential to be supranormal in some sense. So I know you had that experience with the Matrix, but what's your general feeling about whether or how fantastic fiction turns us on to the possibility of being more than a normal human, or being more of what a human can be?
Yeah, there's a quote from Terence McKenna, which I've used in a few of my video essays now, or at least one, where he says that science fiction is a gateway drug to the psychedelic, which I really like. And I think there's a really strong theme of that. And there's the people who are doing it explicitly. I think Philip K. Dick is one of them. And there's the people who are just doing it accidentally. One of the things that I've done a lot is moderate science fiction communities. I have a science fiction group on Facebook at the moment, has like 4,000 members. And so I have a good awareness of who is in the science fiction community. And there's like a minority, maybe 10, 15% of people who are kind of psychedelically switched on in some kind of way. And then there's a big bulk of people who, you know, in spiral dynamics sense, would be like very solidly stage orange people, like modernist thinkers, passionate about science, many of them scientists, very strongly atheist, really often very dismissive of any idea of spirituality at all. And I will sometimes tease those people in my community a little bit by saying, well, don't you think that going into this like darkened auditorium and watching Luke Skywalker literally control things with the Tao, isn't there something a little bit religious about this experience? And generally it's like, no, there isn't at all from those people. But I think there is. I think we are, whether it's because we have some kind of genetic disposition to religion, or whether it's on the cultural or psychological level, what, especially in the really successful science fiction franchises like Star Wars or The Matrix, the Marvel movies particularly, I've been exploring this a lot, are just, or not just, but, you know, they are recreations of ancient myths that are palatable to a modern audience who don't want to think that this is some kind of gateway drug to experiences that are beyond. But I think it creeps up on people as well, especially in the way that we've, you know, you see increasingly like in on the borderlands of the physics community, you know, where it spreads out into cosmology, and the popular physicists who like to talk about things like the God particle, for instance, because it sells some books. A lot of the ideas there, like the multiverse theory, simulation theory, these are all really ideas that were born in science fiction. That's where they're first talked about, at least in our culture. And then scientists just kind of like them. They kind of find them sexy, I think. And of course, they fulfill this religious impetus, which is being denied. And now they're actually being picked up and put back into the mainstream of scientific culture. And when you take something like simulation theory and you start working on it with somebody who really advocates it, and I've got some friends on Clubhouse actually who are really into simulation theory. I've had long chats with them on there, and it, you know, you're getting back to like Hindu Vedanta when you start talking about simulation theory. You go all the way round the materialist circle and get back into kind of idealist philosophies and into religion and spirituality. So I think, yeah, it's completely opening our culture up to these older or newer ways of thinking, depending on how you look at it.
I have an argument about spirituality and religion, which is that there's basically a process whereby an excess degree of coherence and meaning is generated by integrating a lot of our subsystems. And as individuals, that's a spiritual process, and our subsystems are things like intellect, emotion, physiology, left and right brain, conscious and unconscious. Collectively, it's a religious process, and it integrates different genres of social activity. So I would think whenever large genres of social activities start to get merged together, you get a religion-like phenomenon. So if you get hard technical thinkers merging with imaginal thinkers, merging with human psychology, you can't help but get a gestalt overflow of something that's going to start looking increasingly religious. But I have a question for you around religion and science fiction, because it's not difficult to argue that the Bible and the Quran and the Upanishads are science fiction texts, right? They've got aliens, they've got wars, they've got special effects, but we don't typically talk to each other as if those were works of art. We say they're unquestionable and mysteriously generated texts. If someone comes to you and they says, I wrote a neat story about prophecy in an apocalyptic battle and weird non-human creatures and a human divine hybrid descends from the sky, well, that's one thing. But if they say, you need to agree with me that the book of Revelation is unquestionably factual, written by an author who exceeds all human ontological categories, that's very different. Now, from the point of view of the efficacy of story, is story more profound when we take away the notion of the author and let it be as if it were a fact? Or is that a psychological maladaptation of people who just don't want to take creative responsibility for storytelling?
Well, what can we say about who is the author of a story? So I kind of like quite ignorantly play around with ideas of logos and mythos, because sure. I'm not a classics scholar. I've just kind of picked up these terms secondhand, but I find them very useful. I've got a theory as well that when we talk about things from like classical Greek culture that we don't really know very much about, ultimately, they're actually just a way of inventing new ideas for ourselves. So sure. I think as a culture, we're like inventing these ideas of logos and mythos now. And logos is like, we're very into logos as a culture. We're very into logic and ideas that the kind of waking logical mind can deal with, and science and rationality. And we may be the most logos driven culture that has ever walked the earth. And the consequence of that is that we've taken the mythos, which is basically storytelling. So these terms, you know, kind of for Greek culture, the mythos came first, and it's the whole period of creating gods and heroes and telling stories, and that's how the culture shaped its identity. And now we just have the stories, and we've taken them and we've taken the whole mythos essentially, which is like half of our, or maybe much more than half of our psyche. And whilst the logos, we like take it seriously, and we realize that we need to kind of police it in a way and make sure it's healthy to an extent. The mythos we've just thrown at the entertainment industry, and we've said, you just have this, and it's just here to entertain us, and that's all it's there for. But it's there as this massive body of archetypes, stories, emotions, you know, whatever is wrapped up in there. And a storyteller, a good storyteller, is just tapping into it, and they're pulling parts out of it and doing some kind of active synthesis with it. So one of the storytellers I admire is Neil Gaiman, and I was fortunate I got to study with him. I went to the Clarion Writers Workshop in San Diego about 10 years ago. And he's a genius of storytelling. I don't know if you know his work. He wrote like the Sandman comics in his early 20s, which is really envy-inducing because he was so young, and they're this incredible work of mythic genius. But they're all, you know, not to belittle Neil's role in them, but he's just channeling the mythos. Yeah. And he did that really, really well. He was in some way transparent to it. So to what extent is the author producing any of these stories anyway? When we say that, you know, the myths of Genesis, which are fascinating stories, and there's the literary critic Harold Bloom makes an argument for their authorship, that they were probably written by a woman, maybe a highborn woman of like the Babylonian era. Because if you read them like that, then the Old Testament God is, he's really funny, because he's this grumpy old man that this author is making fun of. And then this was later taken out by the scribes who have passed these stories through history. But the main thing is that he's identifying an author for these. So we can do that. But what was that author doing? Well, she was pulling from the mythos as well. So we can make quite a good argument that these stories are sacred. They've come from the mythos, and they're such powerful manifestations of it that they've survived through thousands of years of our society and shaped our society. So the human author of them is kind of a side note.
So
anyway.
Arguably, God writes all science fiction.
He's there in some form.
What am I curious about here? You know, in developmental philosophy, there's a big emphasis on worldviews, and in the ways that our evolving and complexifying cognition can co-evoke more inclusive world spaces if we continue to grow and deepen and self-transcend and things like that. In fantastical fiction, there's a big emphasis on world building, whether as a reader or as a writer. And some people obviously use the concept of writing a story just as a pretext to spend time elaborating an alternative universe. And that feels to them valuable in and of itself. And that's a really curious thing. And I'm wondering what you think about the personal practice of imaginative world building as a possible way of cultivating skills that can then be used by our brains to create a new and richer world perception.
Yeah. There's a writer called M. John Harrison, who is like the science fiction writer's science fiction writer, and much venerated by the people who know of him. And he wrote, it's a weird time that he's a great writer, and the thing he's most famous for is a blog post that he posted called The Clomping Foot of Nerdism, where he says that world building is just missing the point. You should always be telling a story, and world building is like a lesser activity that people just nerdishly enjoy. And the internet exploded like in Mike's face, literally like tens of thousands of people, because there is something like personally very valuable in the act of world building. We do it in role-playing games. We get immersed into worlds in video games because we can literally generate them. The essence of a story is something that can immerse you because it kind of mirrors your psychological structures. So we want this, I think what we want is the experience of immersion into a world. But then the question is, what are we doing within that immersion? And I think if you make a division between the science fiction reader and the writer on a spectrum, the reader can just enjoy the escape into the world. But to transition into being the writer, you have to ask what is actually creating that experience. And when you dig down into the great works of science fiction that have lasted, we've got things like Dune, which is going to be a big new Hollywood movie soon. Isaac Asimov's Foundation series, that's coming to Apple streaming. These aren't really about building worlds. They're about modeling worlds, and they're about modeling societies and politics, which is where I think it cuts very strongly into developmental theory and integral theory. I learned a new quote recently from Giordano Bruno, which I probably should have known. And he was really the first person to predict our universe in kind of the way we see it. And he said, no, it's not crystal spheres and rotating around the Earth. And it's not simply that the Earth is rotating around the sun. It's that this universe is infinite, and there are infinite other Earths within it, and they are peopled by people like us. So it's the first time that somebody had thought of like what we then see in Star Trek, that you could travel across this universe and encounter other worlds of other people. So the natural speculation to make is, well, what is it like for those people? What is their society like? How is it developed over time? So in the genre of space opera, which Star Wars, Star Trek, Foundation, Dune, all forms of space opera, they all play this game. Star Trek loved to do it. You turn up at a new M-class planet, and it's a class 4 civilization on this planet. They're still at a tribal phase, so we shouldn't interfere with them. But implicit in that is the modeling of how our societies grow and how we grow as individuals. So I think whilst we really enjoy the act of world building for escape into the story, actually what makes the worlds real is that we recognize the reality of some kind of model of our society within them.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, because it seems like in terms of the structural dynamics of how bigger stages of complexity unfold in any domain of life, you're embedded in some kind of system, and you have to run up against an alternative and then discover that that alternative has similarities, so that your new meta frame is built out of the similarities shared by both of those. And I was thinking of, when you said that, Descartes, I think it's in First Philosophy or something like that, and he talks about at the beginning being in the wars for years and having to live in other countries. And when he returned to France, he'd spent so much time in these other countries that France seemed like it might as well be a foreign country to him as well, right? And so he's a great avatar of modernity in that moment, where he discovers that his ethnic sphere is really no different than any of these other alternatives that he got to experience. And so I think there's something about the modeling of alternative species and alternative civilizations that reflects a drive. We would like to be able to see some alternate versions of ourselves, so that we can get to a meta level, to get to a level that's beyond just the one we're embedded in as humans.
Yeah, that's a really cool line of thinking, because it was the theory that I've heard is that really it's the merchant class who drive the emergence into modernism, because in a similar experience, they're the people who are traveling. And you travel far enough and you realize that your religion is really just like this other religion, and then this other religion here as well. And they're different in content, but the structure of them is very similar. And you also realize that they have to interoperate so that you can shift black pepper from one place to another without everybody killing each other. So then you have to find your kind of meta narrative, which over a few centuries gives us modernism, basically. But we can't then do that for modernism, because it's global. It gives us our global culture. So we have to speculate. And maybe that's why these stories are there at the moment and so influential. They're giving us this speculative space where we can, this happens quite a lot in science fiction, we can model a postmodern society or an integral society, and see how we kind of rub up against that. And we can question the values of our modernist society as well, in a kind of safe space where you're not going to get shot down for doing it. So yeah, I think that's a great line of thinking.
There's philosophically, there's a tension between discovery and creation, and a lot of very advanced thinkers would argue that you can't even really make that distinction. But when I think about the journey through a story, and if that succeeds, what we're provided with that we can return, I feel like we can see it in either direction. You know, when you were talking to my pal and fellow Ontarian, John Vervaeke, he used the phrase world retrieval as something that the story might be able to accomplish. But when you're a shamanic practitioner, you think in terms of using guided visualization or psychedelic voyaging to do soul retrieval. But soul retrieval is usually regarded as getting your hands on something you already had but lost. And world retrieval is a little bit like discovering something new you didn't know about the world. I mean, there's a tension there. I'm not sure how to put this into the form of a question. What do you think people are getting out of a good story? Are they getting something new they didn't have before, or are they rediscovering something they had and didn't know that they had?
If I want to start an argument with Jungians, I'll tell them that when Carl Jung was working on the Red Book, he became an epic fantasy author. He retreated to his little tower from his psychological practice and into his inner world. And you look at the Red Book and it's like is Tolkien. It's exactly the same process that Tolkien was going through, but for Jung, this became like a sacred text to inform his other work, and for Tolkien, it was a story. And so I think you can turn to a lot of what Carl Jung was talking about to understand what's happening when we go into, especially into a fantasy world. And I think really the reason why science fiction and fantasy are always so closely linked is because they're essentially the same thing, but slightly different flavors of fantasy for people from a different cultural milieu. So, you know, whether it's a journey into space or a quest across a fantasy landscape, what tends to happen is that as the reader, you're being taken into your internal world. So a question I ask students sometimes is like, where does Gandalf live? You know, does Gandalf live in a hobbit hole? Does Gandalf live in the mines of Moria? No, of course, Gandalf lives inside you. The only place you're ever going to meet Gandalf is in your own imagination, sparked by the words of Tolkien. Frodo lives inside you as well. All of the characters do. And in Lord of the Rings and many other like very popular, successful stories, the characters are incredibly archetypal. And they often, you can actually find like a complete map of the Jungian archetypes in almost any successful fantasy or science fiction story. So we go into a darkened cinema, we look into the strange squiggles on a page of a book, and we step into our internal world, and we get guided through our own unconscious. We take that journey of self-actualization that Jung was talking about. And it can be a hugely therapeutic journey as well. And we can connect to those archetypal parts of us, the shadow, the anima. Think about, you know, I read a fantasy series by David Eddings. It was a huge bestseller, and I was like 12 at the time. And I was getting all of these books. And I was in love with the female character in the story, the princess, you know, absolutely. Because that was probably an early experience of like meeting my anima in a story. I think for me, that's what the value is at its most sacred for the reader, that it can be a sacred transformative experience. And that's why somebody like Tolkien, who I think delivers that again and again and again for millions of people across generations, becomes like a sacred figure to our society. And you could see those stories having some role in a future human society that is biblical in nature. And the Bible does the same thing, that same archetypal unity. And that's just viewing it through the Jungian model of the archetypes. You know, it takes us into our inner world and it lets us sort shit out in there. Probably better than a therapy session.
One of the under-inspected features of developmental philosophies like integral or spiral dynamics is the way that our perception of time changes as we move through different value systems and different worldviews. So we can look back anthropologically, and it seems like there's been a progression from a fuzzy dream time to a single great mythic year to people who thought and maybe still think several thousand years from creation to apocalypse, and then the deep multi-billion year time of Darwin and the Big Bang, and then the incredibly strange space-time, multiple quantum timelines, retrocausality loops craziness. So there's a series of increasingly complex visceral experiences of time, right? And if you go to a monotheistic fundamentalist and try to explain to them about the length of time it takes for Darwinian evolution to have created the life we see, it doesn't mean much to them. It doesn't make visceral sense. They feel like a couple thousand years is about right, and anything else is probably bullshit. But I'm curious about the role that time plays in science fiction and also in fantasy, because it seems like there's so much of this is about either the future or the archaic past or time travel or the emotional experience of vast eons. Like what's the role of science fiction in allowing us to touch the experience of time more vividly?
I have some thoughts on this that I think have been on the edge of my consciousness. So your question might drag them out, but they might be confused as well. Because you're right, there's the there's the archaic time, which is like almost a return to the cyclical, and mythic stories exist in a place outside time. Middle Earth is not in time. It exists in eons of time, and it doesn't experience progress because Tolkien wasn't a big fan of progress. And of course, science fiction is obsessed with the future and what's going to come in the future. And maybe a way into these is time travel and time travel paradoxes. And like you say, if you go back to the archaic thinker and try and talk to them about evolutionary time, or to the Christian thinker, for instance, it just doesn't make sense, because that ideological structure or meanplex or developmental stage, it has to have a particular conception of time to make sense. And if you kick out that conception of time as it's 6,000 years long and it was started by God and it's going to end at Judgment Day, if you let go of that, you let go of the whole structure. And that's too much for people to do. And I think we're doing something for the modern mind with science fiction, because it's like increasingly obsessed with time travel. So there's commercial reasons for like Marvel movies to have time travel, because you want to bring back that character who you killed before. But you see it in like Christopher Nolan movies. He's obsessed with time paradoxes, time moving backwards. So I have like an emerging stream of thought that we're trying to conceptualize a new way of thinking about time, maybe non-linear time. This is something you can do in digital worlds. Of course, you can shift time quite radically. And as we spend more and more time online, in virtual worlds, in video games, I think maybe we need some kind of radically different concept of time, as radically different as what we think about now a time is to the person who believes in the 6,000 year time frame. But it's still beyond us to really hold it, or most of us, me. There may be people out there already who are already thinking in these new kinds of non-linear, non-logical time frames that allow them to do things. I spoke recently with a science fiction author who writes under a pseudonym. Quantum is his pseudonym, and he's a coder and a science fiction writer. And his work, just because of the nature of the story, it plays these amazing games with time. And I think there's something about coding that let him do that, because code has to exist in these like very non-linear structures. So maybe he's already thinking in this way. So that's something like an answer. We're trying to come to some new kind of conception of time, and science fiction is playing a bit of a role in that for us, as myths should.
I can see that, and it makes me think of, like you're saying, the difficulty of getting to that place. It reminds me of trying to live at a higher altitude up in the mountains, right? Like it's going to take a while for your body to adapt to that air pressure. What else? Let's talk about nihilism. And I don't mean just people going around saying they believe in nothing. I mean, the more general phenomenon that our apparent values are replaced by things of less value, by things that go nowhere, or are self-nullifying, neutralizing meaning in the world. Because this is something we see in the suicidal individual, but also we see it in cultural phenomenon. And I see it in a lot of, I seem to see it in a lot of big budget contemporary fantastica. Because when I was a kid, people were walking around saying Star Wars is a new religion. And now for 20 years, it seems like people have been walking around saying, what went wrong with Star Wars? Why have so many pointless plot lines and non-inspiring reversals of expectation taken over? All right. And the same thing, like what went wrong with the final 2 seasons of Game of Thrones? Why did they go from a proven ability to inspire millions of people around the world to a general consensus that it fell apart and sucked at the end? Like, what is it about the way we go about making these large mythic cultural productions that puts us at risk of producing a shiny, visually amazing pseudo-ethical tale that suddenly doesn't produce any mythic output that the population is starving for and leaves people feeling ripped off?
Yeah, I mean, there's a practical and a philosophical answer. And the practical answer, as I make like within the science community quite often, because I find myself often in a kind of, to use another Vivacian term, like an opponent processing relationship with a lot of the science fiction community.
Sure.
Who want to be fans of something, and I'm trying to think critically about it, and that forms something of a conflict. So like the new trailer comes out for whatever the new thing is, and I say, but you know, who's writing this? Because Game of Thrones was the success it was because George R.R. Martin is a brilliant craftsman and an inspired like mythic thinker as well, I think. And he wrote 5 books and they filmed those, and then they had the rest to film, and some other joker just had to come up with the rest of what happened, and that didn't work so well. And I think that's the practical issue, that you have a few very inspired creators, Stanley Kubrick, Christopher Nolan, you know, in film and television and books. And generally they have a period of time that they can do this kind of mythic work in, and a limited output, and that's all we have. And then you have an entertainment industry that wants to commodify those things, that wants to turn them into a franchise. So they're going to make
wants to do that quickly.
Yes, yeah. And they employ, you know, whoever will agree to just try and do that and kill themselves in the process, you know. So there's a lot of junk produced. Maybe, you know, the slightly miraculous, well, the thing that steps out of that is the Marvel franchise, because somehow the Marvel franchise does produce stuff that is like very consistent storytelling. And of course, it's all visually amazing, beautiful cast and so on. And also has some level of mythic value continually. So there's something happening there that I think hasn't really happened before in myth making or storytelling, because it's just such an enormous scale. But nonetheless, it is still a product. They found some way to consistently produce this product. But the deeper question is, you know, what are we really drawing from this as our mythology and nihilism? And I think it's this problem of what we're allowed to experience in terms of this step into the religious or the spiritual, because we're predominantly making stories for audiences who certainly don't consciously want to go on a religious experience. They don't want to be told that this is just entertainment for them. And that probably places some limits. There's another step in that I'd like to get to about the nihilism, because I think it is the internal contradiction of the modernist stage. Essentially, for all its strengths, nihilism is its end point. And I think science fiction played a role in this as well. The traditional idea of science fiction, traveling through space in rocket ships, maybe with a hyperdrive. And this gives us an idea of it gives us a meaning. And for, you know, maybe a century or so, this meaning is building up. We're going to make new technology. It's going to give us longer lives. We're all going to have the best home conveniences. Nuclear energy will give us a utopia. And then we'll travel into space and we'll continue the colonialist exercise on alien planets. And then physics starts showing us that everywhere is far too far away. We're not going to get there. There is no life other than us in the solar system. And we do the space race. We get to the moon. It's just a big chunk of rock. It was very expensive. And then that's it. So science fiction provided like the wrong story. Or maybe it was the right story for its time, but it reached an end. The kind of myth of technological progress into space. 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and this all falls apart. And science fiction actually turns inward. You get cyberpunk, you get Blade Runner, you get dystopias, you get climate narratives. The world is going to end. There's going to be a zombie uprising. The AIs will kill us all and enslave us and turn us into batteries. And that early optimism goes away because we just can't see that it's ever going to come true. So instead we fall into this nihilism, I think. And we haven't found a replacement narrative yet of what are we doing as human beings. If we're not kind of God's creation and we're not going to go to heaven, we're just kind of material beings, like fleshy robots in the world. My cat is meowing in the background. So. You know, but that was okay because we were going to go into space. Right. And there was that vision for us. But then it becomes just not okay. What are we really? So I think that nihilism is just about the kind of the end game of the modernist argument. And the question for me is, what's the next big mythic story? What helps humanity get beyond that nihilism?
Yeah, and that's I generally agree. I think a lot of the structural features of the modern layer and the way modern systems operate can be very well intentioned and very shiny and promising up front, but they run into a catastrophe. And then there's a lot of people who wish we could get back to, a 1930s techno optimism, but we've got to be very cautious about that because that might just reinitiate the thing that's destroying us at the moment. And part of the solution, obviously from a storyteller's point of view, you're looking for the story that helps us get to that next phase. But there's also something that all these stories do in terms of skill building, our ability to feel out which way to go. And what I mean is, so our planet is facing a lot of trend lines that seem to be accelerating toward dystopian instability. And it's very plausible to say that human beings en masse need a lot more finesse, a lot more visceral understanding in distinguishing between pro-dystopian actions and scenarios and pro-utopian actions and scenarios. And it seems like Fantastica is an arena where we can sample and find similarities between types of positive outcomes we like and types of negative outcomes that we don't like, right? And there's some, obviously we'd rather live in Dune or The Hobbit than in Blade Runner. So we're like, okay, we're looking, what we want is a world where there's not writing on everything. All the nice worlds seem to have no writing in public spaces and all the bad worlds have like ads everywhere. You're like, okay, we're starting to figure out a little bit about what we want. But I'm curious what you think Fantastica does teach us about how to recognize the steps that lead toward utopias or recognize the steps that lead toward dystopias, because we seem to need to get way better at making that distinction in the present moment.
Well, there's a fairly significant group of people who took Blade Runner as a handbook to the future they wanted to arrive at, or at least the cyberpunk genre that it was a big part of. And like the writers of cyberpunk, like William Gibson, Bruce Sterling, they were depicting absolutely the future that they saw coming and were trying to stop. But I think for the kind of like our Silicon Valley elite now, our tech elite, they're really keen on this future. They want to replace parts of their body with bionic arms instead. They like to have the the strength that comes with that. They definitely like an android girlfriend who's just going to fulfill all their wishes for them. And there's a very strong, and it's super theological, like the transhumanist trend in Silicon Valley, which is all super science fiction inspired. Uploading your consciousness to a computer, living forever in silicon. And it's very interesting because those people, a large proportion of them really believe that this could happen. This is a possibility for the future. And that raises the question of, I think we're having a serious disagreement about what utopia would be and what dystopia would look like. I've done quite a lot of research.
Do you think those people, sorry to interrupt you, do you think they accurately or inaccurately understood the message of the great works of science fiction? Because it seems to me like the characters who have thought we should do it because we can do it are very often the people who are exposed as being morally incorrect through most of our science fiction tales.
I think it's maybe it's incorrect to say that the inspiration is science fiction. Maybe it's like a co-processing thing going on, because I think what's happening there is that if you take these basic the basic paradigm of the modernist stage, the machines, everything is material, and you just push it forward, plus you have your unrecognized religious impulse, you're going to arrive at all of these ideas of kind of becoming a machine or uploading to a computer without having necessarily investigated the moral issues. So it's another manifestation of the internal contradiction, I think, which is completely unseen by many people. Sure. And many of those people listening to me say this would just think I'm an idiot, because they're absolutely certain of that paradigm and its value. And they're really strongly trying to manifest it in the world as well. So I think this is in a way, our coming conflict is that attempt to really manifest the techno-utopia versus whatever stage is arguing against them, maybe the postmodern stage. And I'm trying to understand what the postmodern utopia might be, or even an integral utopia.
I mentioned earlier sort of my integration surplus approach to spirituality and religion. So I'm obviously very interested in how you put things together in a way that makes them seem like they contain too much. Mm-hmm. And I see that in a lot of really interesting science fiction and fantasy. Like for me in Dune, the spice is so intriguing and so central because it brings together multiple real world issues. It's the issue of mind expanding drugs and the problem of a fuel source we need to steal from the desert people all at once. Right? Or Star Wars is a samurai Western space opera all at once that brings together Flash Gordon, Joseph Campbell, and Kurosawa. And you're like, that's too many things in one place. So I feel like it's overflowing. I'm very intrigued by that. The One Ring doesn't just symbolize something. It's like it symbolizes everything you could think that it might possibly symbolize. Do you think this is a reasonable speculation? To what degree do great works of mythic fantasy or science fiction center around things that almost unbearably contain more than they could possibly contain, or that signify more than any one signification?
There's actually an idea in science fiction criticism from Darko Suvin, and he wrote a lot about science fiction. I think he's an East European academic, and he had the idea of the novum, so from the Latin for new, and it's the symbol at the heart of the story, which is the new thing in the world that is transforming the world. So the One Ring in Lord of the Rings is the story's novum. Every character in the story relates to it. the spice melange, or maybe the entire planet Arrakis in June, either Novum at the heart of the story. And the Novum it has this like deep symbolic value, which means it can be related to with many different kind of value systems, whatever the reader or the audience want to bring to them. So the spice melange is particularly fascinating as a novum for us at the moment, and it's interesting to see how it will relate in that story. Maybe with what we were talking about these contradictions of the modernist stage as well, because what's also happening amongst that same group of people is the return to psychedelic drugs and the psychedelic experience, like microdosing and going back to things like magic mushrooms, for instance. And maybe that's a way out that science fiction was already speculating on. Like, our way into space is not to launch ourselves there in rocket ships. It is some kind of transformation of the mind and consciousness. And that would make me quite hopeful if a large mass of people can come to that revelation through mythic storytelling, which maybe they are actually.
Fantastica has, under the conditions of modern civilization, often been ghettoized as being weird. It's called weird because it's surrealistic and it deals with realms that are different from ordinary life. It upsets both the dogmatist and the person who fantasizes that they're a realist. So it's understandable that they would demean it as something weird. But there's also this sense of high weirdness, of encountering a concentrated reality thwarting event or object. We find this in Philip K. Dick and H.P. Lovecraft, in practically every part of a David Lynch film. The presence of something that does not obey our intuitions about ontology, which either challenges us to restructure our worldview or demands that we let go of worldviews entirely and enter more deeply into a relationship with the strangeness that cannot be symbolized properly, cannot be rendered ultimately as a knowable linear feature in the encyclopedia of reality. What do you think science fiction's role is in terms of making us more comfortable and maybe less traumatizable in terms of our encounters with the truly strange, with the unassimilable parts of reality that we just can't make sense of?
Well, I think there's a tendency of audiences to switch off at the point that they can't understand anything anymore. I think the classic example is like Kubrick's 2001. And that's a film that kind of straight, very scientifically minded audiences love, because they can watch the spaceships, and the soundtrack, and it's all beautifully shot. And it is this kind of incredibly shiny vision of going into space. But it's also it's actually Kubrick's intention was to represent that on screen, but then show it wasn't going to happen. So the spaceships in 2001 aren't going anywhere. They take you to orbit, and there's a big hotel there, and there's nowhere else to go, and the moon is empty. And then how do you actually get out into space? Well, you get out there through a psychedelic experience. Yeah. And then, 30 minutes of the movie is the representation, as with all of his cinematic genius and the limited special effects of the time, of these kind of flashing lights coming across the screen, and then the final sequence of Dave Bowman, the astronaut, like going through his final stages of life and then being reborn. And many people who really love 2001 just switch that part of the movie off. They just stop watching at that point, because it's kind of incomprehensible to somebody who isn't looking for some kind of gateway drug into the psychedelic experience. So I think the clever creators smuggle stuff in for their audience. Like Kubrick didn't want to smuggle stuff in. He wanted to smack his audience in the face with something they didn't understand, because he was a very arrogant creator. But somebody like David Lynch, for instance, is smuggling in these potent symbols. So I think his Dune is as much part of the Dune experience as the original books. It's like one great artist meeting another great artist, and they're kind of riffing together. And the thing that David Lynch introduces is like the manifestation of psychic powers that Paul Mordeeb can, just the power of his name is enough to kill. And that's not really in the book. This is something that David Lynch introduces, and the kind of sonic weaponry that the Fremen warriors have. And I think he wanted to talk more about pushing, he wanted to give the audience something to push them further, to weird them more. And that's, I mean, I was fascinated by that film as a kid. I watched it a lot. And I think it's because Lynch is, like you say, he's trying to push as far as possible into the high weird for his audience. And then he runs out of money. So you have a bit of a mess at the end of the film. But nonetheless, I think he does it very, very successfully. And I think it's probably true that science fiction, fantasy, modern mythic storytelling are doing this for us. They're normalizing as symbols things that are in the process of manifesting into our reality and will become very normal in future. I think the robot, for instance, you know, this is a very strange idea, a human-like a machine that we can make, and now it's a major part of our society. Maybe artificial intelligence is a better example. You know, we had to have some way to introduce this before it even existed.
Yeah, it seems like, especially as technology and world changes accelerate, that we're facing so many things that, so many innovations and changes that our ancestors would have had generally long periods of time to adapt to, and we have to adapt to them very quickly, and they're going to seem out of context for us. Like, you know, it was very hard for people to process that Donald Trump became the American president, right? That there's a possibility that hugely strange things are going to happen that we just stare at and go, I can't believe this is the case. Oh. So it seems like there's a role for certain forms of art to say, hey, here's what it's like when you encounter something that you can't believe, and to sort of familiarize ourselves with it so that in our actual lives, it's not as traumatic as it might be. And we can go into a mode of dealing with it rather than a mode of just being overwhelmed by the strangeness.
I think there's quite an observable division between people who follow the science fiction narratives and people who don't, and their level of surprise at what is happening in the world at any given time. Cryptocurrency is a good example. So if you've read Neil Stephenson, like the Diamond Age particularly, then you saw cryptocurrency coming, and many other things related to it. It's not a surprise. And that's happening like across all areas of our culture. Donald Trump is less surprising if you've read a lot of Philip K. Dick.
Right.
Because he prophesied the coming of that particular Messiah.
Yeah, it's very, Trump is Dick's version of Nixon. Yeah, I know. I talked to my father a couple of months ago, and I said to him, you know, did you think you would live to see the American government acknowledge UFOs? And he's like, yeah, sure. We were talking about this 50 years ago. He wasn't surprised.
I've been following the UFO narrative from another perspective, because I'm not sure what's been acknowledged so far, but I started using Clubhouse about 4 or 5 months ago. And it kind of peaked in popularity around the time of UFOs. So you had these rooms with like 600 or 700 people in, and like 100 people on stage in Clubhouse. And many of the absolute leading ufologists in these rooms, like a dozen of them at the same time, like people who've sold 50 books on their UFO encounters and so on. And what was really interesting to me, again, from a science fiction perspective, is the creation of this narrative in reality, the different levels of belief that people are bringing in, and why they're bringing that belief with them as well. And like a lot of it simply centered around distrust of the government.
Yeah.
And authority and power, because we're so distanced from it. And UFOs are a way to express that. And something of the numinous as well. People just want to believe there's something out there.
The authority distrust thing is fascinating. I was asked to do a series of conversations for Rebel Wisdom for private members called Conversations from the Edge. And I interviewed Sean Hargens, who's the head of the Institute for Exo Studies. And one of the things we talked about was, people who felt for years that they believed there was some phenomenon, whatever they regard that phenomenon to be, and that the system was trying to cover that up. How do they then deal with the system saying, yeah, this is happening, we don't know what it is? Do you then believe the system about that, or do you disbelieve the system about that? It puts people in a very curious situation.
It's interesting that you name Rebel Wisdom there, because I've seen David Fuller go through this around the ivermectin issue. I mean, we're straying off topic maybe a little bit here, but I'll come back to it. We're absolutely right to distrust our authorities, but the question is where we draw a line in that distrust and paranoia. And the mistake that, and I've been guilty of it definitely at times, is to default mistrust everything. And that leads us into the situation of like the current issues we have with like vaccine denial, because clearly our medical industrial complex does some really sketchy shit. And it's perfectly right to think, well, that could be the same. But then where do you draw the line and say, but clearly these vaccines are actually effectively helping people. And it would probably be a good idea if you're at risk to take one of these things. And I think it's easy to be overly critical of people, because how should people automatically know when to trust a non-trustworthy authority? There is no automatic way to know that.
This is something that I think the storytelling of the future has a huge role to play in helping us feel our way through a reality in which information itself is dubious. Before we go, I wanted to touch on, I got sent this video of you doing an over-caffeinated critique of Hanzi Freinach's version of metamodernism. I think you essentially argued that although metamodernism is a great aspirational concept, that what he provides in Listening Society and Nordic ideology is just an advanced postmodernism that maybe fails to deeply grasp the crucial transcend and include ethic that we find in Wilberian integralism, and that therefore it's at risk of making the disastrous attempt to push higher worldviews into the political dimension rather than to further them as part of our private psychological mutation. Is that roughly accurate?
Yeah, you've steel-manned me effectively, I think.
Okay, yeah. I was really interested. It gave me ambiguous feelings. I know Daniel Gortz. He contributed to the Metamodern anthology that I co-wrote and co-edited. And I support a lot of his work, but I have to nuance some parts of that. And normally I think of metamodernism as the sociological and aesthetic simplification of integral thought, but I also think of integral thought as the elaborated psycho-spiritual extension of modernity. So I see them as valid different ways of approaching the same attempt. I think maybe you would argue that the real version of metamodern and integrative communities maybe doesn't realize how postmodern they still are. And I feel like I would argue that maybe they're insufficiently and also imprecisely postmodern. I would like to see them being more authentically postmodern, but also with a sharper distinction about what that actually means. Because I think one of the things about this notion of nested levels is, you can't really know what level you're in when you're in it. You can't critique it. You can't figure out what a healthy or unhealthy version is from within it. So postmodernism accurately says, hey, we uniquely grasp the mechanics of modernity, and we're going to tell you the things you should do to modernity in order to make it be a good thing rather than a bad thing. And I think that's valid, but from the point of view of there's some meta level, there's some second tier, there's some other thing, that level has to be able to do that to post-modernity and say, yeah, you guys are correct. We want to privilege you in a sense as being the most elaborated version of all these worldviews, but we have to be able to tell you what's a good version of you and what's not. And you have to get better at it, but also better at doing the good one and not the bad one. So that's my first level response to that.
Well, I mean, I'm fascinated by integral theory and all of the variations of it. And I'm starting to think of it as developmental theory. That's quite recent that I realized it is this broader thing, because I came to it through Ken Wilber initially. And that was mind-blowing. I guess it is for most people. You pick up some Ken Wilber and you're like, this answers like 150 of the most important unanswered questions in my life. So I've thought about it a lot since. And then recently in the last year, I guess, I have kind of stepped back into thinking about it and made that video. And I mean, I should say that I think the listening society, that half of Hanzi's work is like brilliant and super compassionate and is a lot of the answer. And my problems came in like his ideas for politics later on, basically. And I think my basic argument was that I think in the way that, like, if you're tangling with a red stage society, you don't get in the ring and fight a one-on-one duel to the death,
right?
Because that's their stage of thinking. That probably the task for the integral thinker is to not get tangled up in politics in some way. Of course, that's hard to do. And it's only an intuition, because I think the core problem we all have, and I know you've thought a lot about this, dealing with integral and developmental theory, is that probably none of us are really integral, and we're all caught at various tier one stages, and we have various shadows that we're projecting. Like, as I said, I grew up in a completely rational and secular culture and had a very strong scientific and technological education. And I don't feel I can ever really escape that. My psyche will always be rooted there, at least to some extent. And what I see in a lot of the integral community, like Clubhouse again, had some beautiful groups discussing integral theory, and some really great people on there as well. But from my perspective, a lot of the community, I think, is really caught at the stage green, pluralistic, however we want to say it, and the concerns of that. I guess one way to kind of measure where you are is like, who do you have a beef with? And we have a real beef with capitalism, right-wing politics, corporate culture, and those are the signs of the green postmodern tier, I think. And it's a really complex problem, because that tier, that stage, has to manifest itself in the world if we take the developmental model, and it's never had really an opportunity to. It's doing so more strongly. It's making itself felt in politics, and it's going to continue to. But the conflict between the postmodern and the modern is, I'm genuinely scared of what arises from that, because for people who are really just embedded in one without any framework to step out of it. Again, on Clubhouse, I've followed some groups on there of like very modernist thinkers, and they're absolutely terrified of postmodernism, and it expresses itself in like a paranoia about critical race theory or something.
Yeah.
And like them talking about it is like listening to people organizing a rebellion. Lots of them are academics, for instance, and they feel very threatened by this kind of new policing of their culture. So I guess what I'm thinking more and more about is that as one, I think we have to spread the idea of the integral model and developmental theory as far as possible, because I think it's very helpful for people to have that model, even with all the confusions that can arise from it. And the other is like just how to moderate this conflict between the modern and the postmodern, because clearly it's not going to go away. And I guess to finish back at Hanzi, I feel ultimately, and I would love to be wrong, but I feel ultimately he's kind of in the postmodern and will throw more fuel on that fire rather than putting it out. Those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It is a very difficult tangle of things to figure out how to handle, especially because, like you say, we all come from where we come from, right? I grew up in a kind of free-thinking hippie community, but it was also a very rural agrarian community. So, right, I happen to get a lot of sympathies towards, pre-modern agricultural society. But I might just as well not have, right? And if I didn't, then I would be much more top-heavy into the postmodern, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But also, there's a big difference between style and content. And we often, when you come to a community, go, oh, these are the metamodernists or these are the integralists, because they're talking about those things. It's not really what they're talking about. It's the style with which they're talking about it, because they could just as easily be modernists using integral terms, just like you can argue that the universities seem to be producing a lot of pre-modernists who are armed with postmodern cultural concepts. They're not really postmodern. They're not, Camille Paglia said to Jordan Peterson, all the real postmodernists didn't go to the university. They went back to the land. And I thought, oh, that's a very interesting way to phrase that. So you're like, are the people we see talking about postmodernism good representatives of it or not? And when we see, can also the levels thing is tricky, because if you're a modernist, can you even see postmodern? Can you see a level beyond you? And if you can't, then what are you seeing that you're calling postmodern? You're either seeing pre-modernism or a rival version of modernism that's using postmodern concepts. But nonetheless, none of that takes away the danger and the complexity and the weirdness of the situation. So I think you're right that we need to spread more integrative models and also more integrative practices and more integrative stories. But we also are facing a weird cultural civilization situation. This is where I kind of bring Hanzi back in, is that the difference between Nordic forms of capitalist socialism and American or Brazilian or Russian forms of capitalist socialism makes a big difference in terms of the crises we're facing collectively. That we may have a limited amount of time, and it may be that modern societies that have postmodernized more effectively in a healthy way are better positioned to prevent or navigate huge crises that are zooming up on us. So it might be that we have to, from the higher level, push that more than we might otherwise want to push it, while at the same time making sure it doesn't get out of hand, because it has to work with everybody else at the same time. That's a very complicated tangle of circumstances.
Certainly is, yeah. I mean, there's a lot to be said about the meta crisis, so much that I think it might be another discussion.
I'm sure we're at the end of ours right now. This has been fantastic, Damien. I love the chance to discuss these science fiction themes. It's been really nice getting to know you. You're in command of so much information, and you're very articulate, and I find you very centered and relaxed, and I hope we get a chance to talk again sometime.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. This has been really, really great.